Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film. Today we're going to be talking about some of the events in the 1760s and 1770s leading up to the American Revolution. And we'll be doing this through the HBO series John Adams, specifically the first episode entitled Join or Die. Now, the Peace of Paris of 1763 that ended the French and Indian War did end the war for the French, but not necessarily for the Indians. The war had, after all, begun over land claims west of the Appalachian Mountains, and settlers were streaming into the backcountry and over the mountains even before the war was over. After all, Daniel Boone famously killed a bear on a tree in modern-day Washington County in the year 1760. The tree with his name and that note carved in it having blown down early in the 20th century, but it was photographed first. There are those who've suggested that the tree carving may be a forgery because Daniel Boone was fairly educated and could spell words like killed and bear and his own last name, but he was unquestionably here late in 1760, hunting and exploring a path for future settlers. And these settlers did provoke Indians living west of the mountains, and shortly after the French and Indian War ended, American Indians under the leadership of Chief Pontiac briefly united to attack British forts and settlements around the Great Lakes, killing about 2,000 soldiers and settlers before the rebellion was put down, largely through force of arms, but the British, in early form of biological warfare, also gave the Indians blankets as gifts, except those blankets had previously been slept in by men who had smallpox. But Britain's new king, George III, didn't want to have to deal with this kind of thing over and over and over again. And so, in 1763, he issued the Proclamation of 1763, which drew a line, the Proclamation Line, down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and declared that it was illegal for anyone to settle or even trade west of that line without royal permission. So, ladies and gentlemen, you and I are violating the Proclamation Line right now. Now, the British government did not plan to prevent any future settlement of this area. They certainly didn't mean to cut off trade west of the Appalachians, but they wanted that to be carefully regulated. They wanted traders to be licensed. They wanted settlement to come through a series of gradual treaties with the Indians, not just a free-for-all of claiming land west of the mountains. And this makes sense in a way, but from the point of view of colonists who had just fought to open this land to settlement, they felt betrayed. And this would just be the first of many misunderstandings between the British government and their American colonists. But it is worth noting at this point, colonists still saw themselves as British and were proud to be British subjects. As members of the British Empire, they enjoyed more freedom, more self-government than anyone else on Earth, or at least in Europe. And they saw this as being based on a long tradition of liberty. There were traditions dating back to time immemorial. And many of those traditional rights were furthermore written down in law. In 1215, King John had been forced to sign the Magna Carta, recognizing certain rights of Englishmen. In 1689, William and Mary had been required to sign the Bill of Rights, recognizing further rights for British subjects, many of them which would sound familiar to Americans today. And although by today's standards suffrage, or the right to vote, was still pretty limited, it was still much greater than elsewhere. Only 2% of British subjects could actually vote in Britain, but in France there was only one man who could vote, and that was King Louis. Indeed, the British often referred to the subjects of other monarchs, especially the French, as slaves, sometimes even called their own system a republic, because a republic means the thing of the people, and all classes of people, they felt, held together the British government. Most British people had faith in their government, including the British colonists in America, who saw themselves proudly as part of a great British tradition. Now, in Britain, including America at the time, it was believed that liberty was based on property. Only someone with enough property to be financially independent, could truly be free. If you owned your own farm, produced your own food, you could live on your own. If you rented from someone else, or if you worked for someone else, your landlord or your employer might fire or evict you or otherwise punish you if you voted in a way he didn't like. And voting was done publicly. People went down to the polling place, had their name checked by some county official, and they voted for everyone to hear. Often the two main candidates would be standing there to shake your hand or not, depending on how they saw you vote. It was felt that if you weren't willing to say in public who you were voting for, you probably shouldn't vote for him. But, there certainly were some problems with this system too. As a consequence of this belief that liberty was based on property, only men who owned a certain amount of property could vote. Now that varied between Britain and the colonies. It varied from colony to colony. And most colonies allowed a much larger percentage of the population to vote than could vote in England, although still being limited to property-owning adult men, is less democratic than we would expect today. Now, besides this long-standing tradition, there's also a newer theory called contract theory, which had developed in the 1600s and 1700s, which basically said there was a sort of contract, a social contract perhaps, between the government and the governed. That that the government was supposed to protect the people, in particular protect their liberty and their rights. And if a government did not protect its people, then the people did not owe the government their loyalty. And so under both these theories, long-standing tradition and contract theory, a just government could not just take a free person's property, except the government takes our property all the time in the form of taxes. But in a way they didn't. The belief was that taxes were actually not taken by the government, but they were the gift of the people to the government. Now, last time you went to the store and bought something, you may not have really felt like giving a gift of 9.5% of the purchase price to the governments of Washington County and the state of Tennessee. And yet, in a way, you did choose to do that through your elected representatives. And so, taxes, under at least British theories, could only be created by a representative body, Parliament in Britain, or various colonial legislatures, a House of Burgesses or a General Assembly, every colony electing part of its government. In Britain, it was the House of Commons, the elected half of Parliament, that could create new taxes, a power known as the power of the purse, and a power that had allowed Britain's Parliament to become more and more powerful. Anytime the king wanted to do something new, he would have to give up a bit of power to Parliament in exchange for Parliament creating the new taxes that the king needed to fund whatever his project was. And they guarded that privilege, that power, very jealously. And the same belief was in America, as I already mentioned. Only legislatures like Virginia's House of Burgesses or other colonial assemblies could create a tax for that assembly or for that colony. So direct tax on your property should only be created by your elected representatives. Although, as part of a larger empire, most colonial thinkers, at least the sort who thought about the philosophy behind taxation, did accept that the British government could create taxes on trade that applied to all the colonies, because that was meant to regulate the imperial economy as a whole. And the British Parliament did sometimes create tariffs and other trade restrictions, and in theory, colonial leaders accepted this as legitimate. Indeed, before the 1760s, there were some taxes of this sort in place. The Molasses Act of 1733 taxed molasses and some other sugar products. There were some older acts and taxes like this as well. But the truth is, many of them were not enforced very strictly. Many Americans got around these pretty easily. Some got quite wealthy off of smuggling. John Hancock, the great revolutionary leader, was accused of smuggling. There's no question a lot of his family's fortune came from his father's work as a smuggler. But the French and Indian War would change things. Following the war, Britain would be deep in debt, and furthermore, would need to police the Proclamation Line, and would have to pay for all this somehow. And Parliament came to feel pretty rapidly that since the French and Indian War had been fought on behalf of the colonists, at least in part, the colonists ought to pay for it, at least in part. But unfortunately, many colonial leaders would feel otherwise. And as Parliament in London tried to create taxes for the colonies, it would drive them apart. Likewise, the French and Indian War had exposed other tensions. And during the war, many colonial leaders, especially militia officers like George Washington, had felt slighted, insulted by the British military officers and other officials they had to deal with. Made worse by events like Braddock's Blunder, pictured there, in which British officers and soldiers themselves came off as incompetent, unprepared to fight in America, while the British in turn saw many militias undisciplined and incompetent themselves. Anyway, the war was over now. Colonists didn't see a need to pay for thousands of soldiers in America anymore. But again, Britain had to pay for this somehow. And in April of 1763, George Grenville was named Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he would try to get the colonies to pay for the war, at least in part. Britain would still have paid off most of the debt, but indeed they are still paying for it. But the colonists would do their share. And he would get Parliament to pass a number of laws. The Sugar Act of 1764 cut the Molasses Act tax in half, but it actually tried to enforce that tax, giving British authorities more power for search and seizure of potentially smuggled sugar and sugar products like molasses. Colonists, again, didn't see a need for new taxes now that the war was over. Definitely they saw no need for a bunch more royal officials to collect taxes and enforce the law. And possibly worst of all, at least in principle, if you were accused of smuggling and breaking this law, you were not tried in your own colony by a jury of your peers, a long-standing English tradition, but rather would be hauled back to England to be tried by an Admiralty Court, a group of naval officers who most colonists figured would not give them a fair trial. As the colonists saw it, Britain was changing the rules, threatening their rights as Englishmen. Still, most colonists felt that while these things might not be ideal, the Sugar Act was legal and within the rights of Parliament. It was a tax meant to regulate trade for the empire. So opposition was limited, although there were some petitions and some boycotts of taxed goods, but that was about it. There were also some colonial leaders, like Benjamin Franklin, who warned the British government that this, and especially some later taxes, were a bad idea. The Sugar Act, though, was not Grenville's only tax. As soon, he got Parliament to also pass the Stamp Act in 1764, although it would not go into effect till 1765. This was a tax on most printed documents, including legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers, and some other paper goods, and other things too, like dice. And this was a direct tax levied right on people's property to make money for the government. Furthermore, it especially hurt newspaper editors, businessmen, lawyers, government officials, the kind of people who could really organize resistance. Although it was hard for lots of people because all the tax on individual items wasn't that high. the stamp you had to buy had to be paid for in gold or silver, and not colonial paper money. In fact, gold and silver were pretty rare in the colonies. And many loyal citizens advised against this, but they were ignored, and colonists began to protest. Patrick Henry in Virginia began his career by condemning the Stamp Act in the House of Burgesses. Pamphlets were written against the act, but were largely ignored by Parliament. Eventually, representatives from 9 colonies met in New York in 1764 in what's called the Stamp Act Congress to try to plan a way to resist this one specific act while remaining loyal to the king. That is important. For a long time, for over 10 years, colonial leaders, for the most part, criticized Parliament. They criticized royal officials. They criticized the king's advisors, but they did not officially, directly criticize the king himself, because that might possibly be treason. But they will criticize this parliamentary policy. They didn't really accomplish much in the Stamp Act Congress besides discuss resisting the Stamp Act, but it helped to set a precedent of colonial leaders working together to resist British policy. And other groups appeared as well. In Boston, for example, the Sons of Liberty formed to kind of serve as vigilantes to harass anyone taking part in enforcing the Stamp Act, led by men like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere, and others. Indeed, by late 1765, all the officials who were supposed to sell the tax stamps were afraid to do their duty. And in 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed, and a sugar tax was reduced. But to prove a point, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, declaring that they had the absolute right to pass laws of all kinds that were binding over the colonies. So the crisis was not over. Indeed, this is how things would often go. In a decade to come, the British would pass an unpopular law, colonists would resist, and Britain would back down, but then pass something else that ticked off the colonists again. And so who knows? If Britain had been more sensitive to begin with, things might have gone better, or if Britain had been tougher to begin with and really enforced the Stamp Act, while colonial resistance was still fairly limited. Either way, maybe they would have kept the empire together. But Britain went back and forth the entire time. But in 1766, Britain made another change, replacing George Grenville with William Pitt as Prime Minister. And he'd played a big role in winning the French and Indian War for Britain and for the colonies by focusing on the war in the colonies. He was seen by the colonists as their friend, but pretty soon he started to get sick of them, feeling they were complaining about the costs of being part of a great empire that protected them and gave them access to the greatest markets on earth. His Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically Secretary of the Treasury, Charles Townshend, was frustrated too, but he tried to consider the colonists' point of view. If taxes on trade are okay, that's what they'll get. A series of taxes known as the Townshend Acts, which, in 1767, placed taxes on certain imports to the colonies: glass, paper, lead, paint, tea, and others, supervised by a board of customs officials headquartered in Boston, and who were generally resented. The taxes resulted in protests, boycotts, violence. Merchants signed non-importation agreements, agreeing not to buy these goods that were taxed. And in turn, British merchants who were hurt by this complained to Parliament. Now, some American merchants signed these agreements out of patriotism, others out of fear of violence from groups like the Sons of Liberty. But there was some low-grade violence for some years, finally reaching a climax in Boston in 1770, where Britain had sent more soldiers to deal with the riots and other protests taking place. They in turn were resented by the local people, who often teased them and gave them a hard time, But the British soldiers were not allowed to respond. They had to keep their discipline to avoid an incident. But on the night of March 5th, 1770, a crowd of about 60 Bostonians, perhaps led by the former slave, the escaped slave, Crispus Attucks, a really huge guy, started harassing about 10 soldiers guarding the customs house. They were cussing at him, spitting at him, throwing rocks and chunks of ice and oyster shells, which might not seem like much, but they're actually moderately heavy and sharp on the edges. They were threatening them with clubs. One soldier was hit by a club and knocked down. Angry and frightened, the soldiers fired their muskets into the crowd, killing or wounding 11 civilians, including Crispus Attucks, who died on the spot. The Sons of Liberty can describe this as the Boston Massacre, and it was depicted in this engraving by Paul Revere as propaganda because it shows the British, under their officers' orders, firing a volley into a crowd of innocent people who are bleeding on the streets. There's even a cute little dog in the bottom because everybody loves the cute little dog. The soldiers were put on trial in Boston and defended by John Adams, himself a very vocal opponent of British policies and a cousin to Samuel Adams, the Son of Liberty. But he and some local leaders wanted to prove that even British soldiers could get a fair trial in Boston. And he was successful for the most part in defending his clients. While all had been accused of murder and thus liable to death, he managed to have most found not guilty. Only 2 were found guilty, and they were found guilty of the much reduced sentence of manslaughter. So rather than being hanged, they were just branded on their thumbs with a hot iron. Although if they were ever found guilty of killing someone again, they couldn't plead manslaughter again and would be executed. But they all went back to England, and as far as I know, never shot anybody again. Although, who knows. In response to this violence, Parliament again tried to moderate things. King George III replaced William Pitt with a new prime minister, a friend of the king, Lord North. And they repealed all the Townshend duties but one, the tax on tea. In fact, they had done all this the same day as the Boston Massacre. Had Parliament in those days announced their policies by Twitter, the Boston Massacre might have been avoided. But for some reason, they didn't do that. But after this, not much happened. Resistance died down. Although some colonists who were opposed to British policy kept each other angry through committees of correspondence. As potential revolutionaries in several colonies wrote back and forth to each other to keep each other up to date on the latest British policies that made them mad and other issues. Some of the leading figures in these committees of correspondence were Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, Thomas Jefferson, and Patrick Henry of Virginia, but there were others. Still, things were going better, it seemed. The economy was picking up in the early 1770s, and most colonists were willing to live with the fairly low tax on tea and the tax on molasses and other sugar products from the Sugar Act. But then in 1773, Parliament acted again, passing the Tea Act, which gave a complete monopoly on the sale of tea to the colonies to the East India Company. This lowered the cost of tea for most Americans because it reduced some taxes. Furthermore, it let the East India Company bypass wholesalers and sell directly to the people, thus cutting out the middleman. But that offended wholesalers who feared they would be bankrupted. And furthermore, this was seen as an act of corruption. The East India Company, a huge company, perhaps one that in today's parlance we would say was too big to fail. East India Company had a lot of stock out there, and a lot of stock in the company was owned by members of Parliament and royal officials who benefited from this act, propping up the company in which they owned stock. So this seemed like a corrupt action by many people, and as a monopoly. Local merchants said once they were driven bankrupt, then the East India Company would jack prices up once there was no competition. And even more royal officials would enforce this tax. But at first, most colonists didn't seem to care that much. Tea was popular. Close to half the population drank it daily. It may have been even more popular than rum. But there were some who continued to stir up trouble. The Sons of Liberty threatened merchants and tax officials, in some cases tarring and feathering them, stripping off their clothes or not, coating them in hot tar, although pine tar, not modern petroleum tar, but still pretty unpleasant, and rolling them around whatever they'd scooped out of the chicken coop, so feathers and everything else, the chickens dropped behind them. Unpleasant and embarrassing. Some had hot tea poured down their throats. Some officials had their houses torn down, which was seen as a semi-legitimate form of protest in those days. And some tax officials and other officials were pretty frightened. And finally, a large shipment of tea arrived in Boston Harbor. And to prove a point, I guess, the acting governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, an American-born man, loyal to the crown, said that because the tea had arrived there in late 1773 in Boston, the taxes on the tea had to be paid, and the ships couldn't leave. But a mob at the docks refused to let the ships unload or sell the tea. But again, the governor would not let them leave, so the ships were trapped there. Finally, the captain of one of the ships went ashore and asked the Sons of Liberty for help, or asked for help in general. The Sons of Liberty creatively misinterpreted his request that they help get the tea off the ships, as about 60 of them, dressed as Mohawk Indians, in theory as a disguise, but people knew who they were, but they could say they were disguised. About 60 Sons of Liberty, or Mohawk Indians, went aboard the ships and dumped about 10,000 pounds worth of tea into Boston Harbor, while about 2,000 local people stood on the docks and cheered. Now, it's kind of hard to convert money then to money today, especially because some things have gone up in price much more than other things. But for this period, if I'm going to do a real rough estimate, I would take a British pound and multiply it by 400. So this is probably at least $4 million worth of tea in today's money, possibly more than that. And there were other tea parties elsewhere in the colonies, and Parliament was not happy, and especially with Boston, which often seemed to be at the center of these troubles. And so in 1774, Parliament passed what they called the Coercive Acts, coercive meaning forceful, and what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. There are 4 of these, and I'll mention them all. As long as you know what they did overall, you're probably fine. Although if you remember the names of them, the names pretty much say what they do. The Boston Port Act shut down Boston Harbor completely until all the taxes on the tea and the destroyed tea itself were paid. Of course, Boston was one of America's major ports. I'd say at this point probably our 3rd or 4th largest city as well. The Massachusetts Governor Act replaced the local man, Thomas Hutchinson, with a British-born governor, and not just any British-born governor, because that was not unusual, but with a military governor, General Thomas Gage, who had the power to appoint a local council, or his own council, and able to shut down the town meetings that ran local government in Massachusetts. The Administration of Justice Act ensured that royal officials charged with any crime would be tried in the colonies, not tried in the colonies, but taken back and tried in England, where it was assumed they would get off scot-free. Colonists figured this would let royal officials do whatever they wanted in America and get away with it. And the Quartering Act introduced many more troops into Massachusetts to enforce the laws, and they had to be supported any way the military saw fit. If Boston would not build barracks for them, as they were told to do, they would simply be put in private homes. So you might suddenly have a couple soldiers as roommates, and you not only had to let them live in your house, but like feed them breakfast as well. Furthermore, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which was not part of the coercive acts, but the colonists considered it an intolerable act as well. It expanded Quebec, the French-speaking colony that Britain had taken from France in the French and Indian War, all the way down to the Ohio River, so that a lot of land claimed by, say, Virginia, New York, and other states was suddenly taken away completely. Furthermore, it protected the French language, which just seemed indecent. It protected the Catholic Church, which many Protestant colonists distrusted. And worst of all, Quebec did not have an elected legislature. And so this was seen as cutting off democracy for a large part of North America, and perhaps serving as an example for how to limit or end democracy elsewhere. So this too was seen as intolerable by the colonists. The House of Burgesses called for a day of prayer for Massachusetts. And today, when there's some tragedy and people send their thoughts and prayers, some people kind of make fun of that and suggest there's not much substance to it. But people felt differently in the 1770s when the House of Burgesses offered their thoughts and prayers to the colony of Massachusetts. The governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, dissolved the House of Burgesses. But they just went down the road to a tavern, the Raleigh Tavern, where they called for a meeting of all the colonies to decide what to do next. And later that year, September 5th to October 26th, 1774, delegates from 12 colonies, not Georgia, arrived in Philadelphia, 55 men in total, where they began to debate how to deal with this massive infringement on their liberties. Some of these delegates were sent by their colonial legislatures, but some were sent by what they called reconstituted assemblies. In 6 colonies, the royal governors had dissolved the local elected legislatures, and so people simply developed new ones, unofficial ones of their own. And the events of this period we've just discussed are depicted in the first episode of HBO's series, John Adams, an episode entitled Join or Die, after a famous political cartoon by Benjamin Franklin, originally meant to encourage the colonists to work together during the French and Indian War, but recycled during this crisis to encourage the colonies to work together in resisting British policies. Now, the entire series was a 7-part series produced in 2008. It is based on a biography of John Adams, a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, published a few years before, 2000, I believe, 2001. The first episode focuses on John Adams' career as a lawyer in Boston in the years 1770 to 74, so more time passes during the episode than is really obvious. But as a time period, it includes the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the passage of the Intolerable Acts, and the election of delegates to the First Continental Congress. Now, while episode 1 is set in Boston, most of the filming was done in colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, where many colonial buildings have been restored, and a few have been recreated, as a good way to depict, buildings from the 1770s. In some later episodes, scenes set in Europe were filmed in Hungary, where I guess filming was cheap, not actually filmed in France or the Netherlands or Britain, where the scenes are set. Obviously, John Adams is the main character of the series. He's a farmer and a lawyer living near and later in Boston. Although in the 1760s and early 70s, he did criticize British policies and criticized them more heavily than the show suggests. He did oppose violence against royal officials. He did come to support complete independence from Britain earlier than most colonial leaders, most of whom claimed to want peace and unity up to the very end. He would serve in the First and Second Continental Congresses, later as a diplomat to France, the Netherlands, and Britain. He would help to write Massachusetts' state constitution after independence, and would eventually serve as America's first vice president and second president. His wife was Abigail Adams. Together, they had 6 children, including future President John Quincy Adams, although only 4 of their children lived to adulthood. In the episode we'll see, all of them are portrayed as being a bit older than they really were at the time. Some who are running around doing, kid things should have been infants when the movie begins, but a pretty minor point. Abigail Adams and John Adams seem to have been deeply and truly in love. And Abigail was an important advisor to Adams, as whenever she could be, although in his political career forced him to be away. In another part of America or even in Europe, she stayed in Massachusetts and managed the family farm and raising all the kids. Samuel Adams is John Adams' cousin, a leading figure in the Sons of Liberty. At one point he worked in his family business making malt, an ingredient that goes into beer, for which he's honored by the Sam Adams beer brand today. But he was never really successful as a businessman. Instead, he devoted himself to the cause of resisting British tyranny and eventually promoting independence. To this day, historians debate how much he supported mob violence and vigilantism, which the British accused him and the Sons of Liberty of promoting. Certainly in the miniseries, he's depicted as a very strong supporter of violent opposition to British authority. And in reality, he was probably somewhat more moderate. He approved of John Adams working as a lawyer for the accused British soldiers in the Boston Massacre aftermath, again hoping to show Boston could give them a fair trial. And again, he did make a point of claiming loyalty to the king until pretty shortly before the Declaration of Independence, even if he was a very strong critic of Parliament and many royal officials. He would serve in the First and Second Continental Congresses, and later as governor of Massachusetts, where, perhaps ironically, he would use the military to crush a rebellion against taxes in the western part of the state. John Hancock was another leading member of the Sons of Liberty, a merchant and one of the richest men in the 13 colonies, having inherited a shipping business from his uncle. The British accused him of smuggling. Historians debate whether or not that was correct, but it probably is, at least to some extent, as most colonial merchants imported goods from colonies of other European countries, especially European colonies in the Caribbean, which produced sugar and molasses, and didn't pay their taxes on it. And he was a pretty early supporter of independence from Britain, later served as president of the Continental Congress, is famous as the first man who signed the Declaration of Independence. He would later be governor of Massachusetts, too. And Captain Thomas Preston was the British officer in command of the soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre. He was accused of ordering his men to fire. He always insisted he didn't order them to do that. They acted on their own out of fear of the mob. And after many lawyers known to be loyal to the British Crown refused to defend him and his men in court for fear of losing business or themselves suffering violence, he asked John Adams to represent him in court, and he did so. Although, in fact, there were 2 separate trials. Preston was tried separately from his soldiers. HBO shows as a single trial for simplicity's sake. And so, we'll now watch this episode of John Adams from HBO.